This is a summary of Carl Jung's The Undiscovered Self.
Chapter 4. The Individual's Understanding of Himself. Humans are capable of understanding, inventing and planning for the future, but we lack these things in regard to the knowledge of the self. What Jung called the quantity negligible. We are a negligible quantity, in many ways an enigma and contradiction. We can easily judge physiological distinctions between other organisms, but despite being a conscious being, we lack a self-judging criteria. Self-knowledge and judgment is the one thing that makes us unique, yet it is also a mystery to ourselves. Being the youngest science of the sciences, psychology at first had to contend with the mythological symbolism, as well as against the materialistic idea that the psyche is an epiphenomenon, that consciousness is just a byproduct of biochemical processes in the brain. As opposed to psychology, parapsychology is rejected, since they are usually the product of hasty explanations. Jung questions reductionism in regards to understanding the complexity of the psyche, since it can't be reduced to the structure of or the physiology of the brain. Consciousness is paramount, since without consciousness, there is no outer reality, for consciousness is a precondition of being. Hence, mental being, or the psyche, is just as important as physical being. The individual is the carrier of consciousness, who is a product of the psyche which gradually awakens during childhood. The emphasis on the individual is more important, since firstly, it counteracts the statistical rule, because by definition, individuals are unique, and secondly, it is permitted by religion insofar as individuality is under the heel of the collective. Focusing too much on individuality is considered by religion and the statistical scientific analysis as egotistic obstinance, since it is devalued as being spiritually prideful in the former and very subjective in the latter. Jung believed fear of the unconscious was the greatest obstacle to self-knowledge, and that it was this fear that led to the devaluing of the subjective and the rise of dogma. There are problems in the scientific approach, as discussed in Chapter 1. Limitations in the nomothetic approach in using experiments and creating generalizations doesn't translate very well into the realm of medical psychology. Subjectivation occurs when the practitioner and the patient engage in dialogue, which delves deeper into the uniqueness of the patient's situation. It is both important to know generally as well as understand specifically the neurosis. Discourse, or one-on-one communication, is a complicated process, since the doctor aims to understand and treat the condition, having to monitor what they say as to not trigger the neurosis. The doctor provides a different angle, one that the patient can't see, and fosters a relationship so that the treatment could take place. It would be unwise to compare the individual to the norm or society, since that may lead to the de-individuation and an inability to express the true self. A compelling question to ask is, why people form groups in the first place? Jung answers that groups lead to a sense of security. Similar to safety and wish fulfillment in childhood, groups and groupthink leads to the fulfillment of all needs, absolute answers to questions, and irresponsibility, where one doesn't have to worry about anything. This paves the road to tyranny, which is always ipso facto immoral, since it leads to the devaluing of the individual. Man is a consequence of his environment, which Jung spoke of as the world conditioning psyche, as well as the product of biology in the form of instincts and archetypes. This leads to a continual conflict as to serve our nature or to serve what we have been conditioned, bringing about one-sidedness. So it's basically the nature versus nurture debate. Conflict can lead to paradoxical dissociation, as one must give in to one whilst forsaking another, either giving into our nature for the sake of what we have learnt, what we've been nurtured to do, or giving into what we've been nurtured to do for the sake of our nature. The ultimate goal for the individual psyche is to produce a synthesis, to reduce contradiction, whether between nature or nurture, or between the ego and the unconscious. The synthesis must culminate in an experience, often expressed as a symbol. This ties back into religious symbols that have managed to stand the test of time even though they are not fully comprehended. It is difficult to get rid of spirituality, since it is instinctive and serves a function for the human being. When this natural function for faith is lost, something else takes its place, and this results in disturbance, whether it be a desire for money, work, sex, power, etc. Those who are unconscious of their shadow or dark side project this into how they see other people. It is much easier to point out the problem and project into greater systems, such as the evils of communism, as opposed to evaluating the problems of the individual's mentality. This can culminate between the battle of the individual rational conscious and the infantile fantasies of the unconscious. Neuroses come into fruition when strengthened by abnormal circumstances and when coming up against a problem that could not be consciously solved. The neurotic builds up in the unconscious until it breaks through the conscious into the level of the conscious. As a result, this leads to dissociation and splitting of the ego. Jung borrowed heavily from Freud, his mentor, who saw mental processes as if they resulted from hydraulic pressure, where an excess led to an increased pressure, or in this case a neurosis. It must be vented out eventually. Jung believes that this leads to impulses and a blurring of the lines between imagination and reality, being expressions of the archetypes. Impulses and instinct take over, which aren't blind processes, since they were adapted in order to cope with external situations, the environment. These instincts, however, may surprise the modern man, who have adapted and developed their will, consciousness, and reason. Thanks for watching.